Hey guys, Eddie back with Couch Talk. Welcome back to the show. If it's your first time with me, welcome to the show. Guys, please hit like, please hit subscribe, turn your notifications on. I promise if you stick with me, I will earn your viewership. So I'm going to do something a little bit different today. I don't usually do this, but I'm going to do kind of like a movie review. I watched a movie last night called You People, and it's on Netflix. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It is a great movie. Kind of like a Guess Who's Coming to Dinner with some twists, with a modern element, and instead of the traditional like black family clashes with white family culture shock, it's black family with a white Jewish family. So there's some additional elements, some additional interactions that are kind of displayed over the movie, and of course Jonah Hill, Eddie Murphy, and just the situation in general provide for the all-star cast. It's like a fantastic, comedic thing, and I think Jonah Hill did a fantastic job. Just blew it out of the water. But there's some heavy racial elements in it, and it brings up some interesting critiques on society and some interesting points that I wanted to kind of address because it bears a resemblance to what we've been discussing so far. And it kind of starts off with boy meets girl, and the way they meet is kind of an interesting situation. So what happens is Jonah Hill gets into the cab of his would be girlfriend, except it's not a cab, right? So he thinks it's like an Uber or a Lyft driver, and of course there's a case of mistaken identity because his Uber thing says that it's an African American woman who looks kind of like her and is driving a Mini Cooper. So it's like he couldn't help but make that mistake. Although opening the door is kind of odd, but he just hops in, and of course she immediately jumps to the conclusion that he is making a kind of a racist assumption, that is an African American car nearby, so it must be a Lyft driver, right, or something, which is kind of an odd stereotype to assume because I don't know anything in particular about Uber driving that would indicate an African American profession. All the Uber drivers I know happen to be Caucasian American, but I mean, I'm sure. I think it's a pretty race blind profession, but I could see where she's coming from. But it's interesting to note though that is the original assumption, right? That it's a racist assumption, not just a race blind assumption about a car being parked out front where an Uber was called, right? So but it starts out with some high stress, some high tension, which always builds for a great romance, and then of course the story carries on, and you get all the typical culture shocks, and then but not necessarily between, in this case, not necessarily between the guy and the girl, but always usually with the families, right? So there's a scene that I want to talk about where they're sitting down to dinner with both families, both parents are there, and they're talking about what I think Eddie Murphy or his wife Nia Long is talking about. Black people just don't get along well with water, and it's a kind of a funny sarcastic remark, and then I think Julia Louis-Dreyfus says, like kind of like Jews with trains, right? With an obvious reference to the Holocaust, and then Eddie Murphy says, wait, were you trying to compare the Holocaust to slavery? Which again is a really odd remark, right? Because swimming has nothing to do with slavery, at least as far as I know. I mean, maybe if someone can think of a reason why that would be a slavery related incident, let me know. Put it in the comments. It may just be my naivety. But as far as I know, there's nothing particular about swimming that, was and had anything to do with slavery. But so of course, but it starts the friction. And of course, the friction had to start somehow. So that may be just the plot device. And then they go into this thing where, they start comparing the Holocaust to slavery. Like, of course, that just has to happen to have that friction between the parents. But it's interesting to hear them go back and forth, because of course the Jews are like, well, we were slaughtered by the millions. And then the African Americans are like, well, but slavery lasted a lot longer, and and you guys don't seem to be doing badly now. And the Jews are like, well, yeah, it's because we work hard for it. It's not like we don't deserve it. And then they're like, well, but you kind of also had some additional boosts, right? Well, it was your parent was a podiatrist, their parents were podiatrists. We didn't have that luxury. Our grandparents were cotton pickers. So it went back and forth and back and forth, and it's always interesting to see this interaction. Now, one of the questions I have for the audience, for those of you who have more experience with this particular interaction, is there, some tension between Jews and African Americans? I did not really know that there was. I mean, I've heard Dave Chappelle do a spoof on it once, and it was a funny skit, but still I thought it was just something that he was making up kind of just to be funny. But maybe there is, some rivalry there, which it's an intriguing rivalry, right? And it's one of the things that I see happen in society kind of subconsciously a lot. And it's what Candace Owens, young African-American lady who works for the Daily Wire, often calls the victim Olympics, right? So what these two groups of people are doing is they're basically arguing over who's had it worse in the past, which is, again, intriguing as they're relatively young people. And so neither one of them would have had much experience with the past transgressions in the nation, right? Like, I think probably that, Eddie Murphy plays the role of somebody who would have maybe been a young African American during the civil rights time period. So maybe he saw some of that. I don't see how the Jews would have seen much of it, but maybe their parents did, have experiences with the Holocaust within the scope of this story. But it's just interesting to see them fight over who's had it worse, right? Like, not something you would typically want to have. But it mirrors what I see in society these days quite frequently. It's like what we're doing is we're trying to establish identities as the people who have had it worse. And one thing Ben Shapiro does is he has this giant list of people from top to bottom, either who's got the most privilege according to societal standards, or if you flip the list, it's basically whoever's been marginalized the most, or been had it, basically the people that have had it worse. And it's interesting that it's like a competition, right? It's really weird. I don't think of life this way, right? I never think to say, oh yeah, well, I had it worse than you did. No, me. Like, that doesn't seem to be. And of course, this is spoken right from the luxury of the white male privilege. But I just have never seen this white male privilege, so I guess that's part of the problem, right? Maybe I'm not seeing what the appeal is of being the biggest victim. I don't know. I mean, I guess there's a natural sympathy that would be involved. I mean, and I think that it is important to be sympathetic to everyone's history. But I feel like there's never going to be an ancestral history that is even remotely as important as one's personal history, right? Like, you take me, I grew up dirt poor. I grew up in a very high crime rate area in a very poor section of town. But I don't think of myself as someone who grew up in a poor section of town. The only reason I even mention it on this channel is because it seems like these days, unless you have some form of marginalization to you, people don't respect the wisdom that you can bring to bear. It's like if I don't tell you that I was in a poor situation, like if I told you I was, born with a silver spoon in my mouth, all of a sudden it's like people wouldn't even listen to me. So I hate that it's like that, but I even catch myself doing it. You know what I mean? Like I even see myself saying, well, look, I grew up dirt poor, but I do so not to brag about where I was. I do so to demonstrate pride with how far I've come. And it's interesting that I sometimes see that be the opposite in some of the other cultures that I've met, right? But not all of them. And I think it's a very individualized thing. I think that's important to say that. And I think of everybody's personal history as a very individualized thing. I think everybody's ancestral history is an individualized thing. So another situation that takes place in the movie that's kind of intriguing, and it's again presented as a kind of a racism, but in reality, I don't think it is. And that is when Amira gets she does this presentation for these guys, and I think it's a designer presentation, and she's talking to two guys who are obviously Harvard grads, right? And at the end of the presentation, they're eating it up, right? At the end of the presentation, they're like, "Oh, so man, like, what year did you graduate? Because we may know some of the same people." And it was going to be an alumnus-based camaraderie, and of course, she has to inform them that they misunderstood her, that she graduated from Howard, not Harvard, right? And they're like, "Oh, I gotcha. So, and then of course, again, it's presented like a discriminatory thing, and it is, but it's not discriminatory against African Americans. It's discriminatory against people who aren't Harvard alumnus. And I mean, so at this point, like what you see a lot in modern society is the counter to that presumption is that, well, she didn't go to Harvard because she's African American. Well, that's not necessarily true either, because Harvard loves to admit African Americans. In fact, they have a very aggressive affirmative action program that is currently being challenged in the Supreme Court as we speak. So it's not that she could not have tried to get into Harvard. I don't know if she did. There's no backstory on it in the movie. Maybe she did and got turned down. Who knows? But maybe she didn't ever try to be part of Harvard, right? As far as I know, I don't know that Harvard's a very good design school anyway, so I'm not sure that's where she would have wanted to go. So it's kind of a weird situation, but it triggers another fight, between her and Jonah Hill. And she comes back, and then, he offers to get her a job. He offers to at least try to call his uncle and see if he can set her up. And she basically turns him down, saying, everything I've gotten in life, I've gotten for myself. I don't want a handout. I don't want charity. And he's not trying to do any of those things. So, of course, it again turns into a high tension situation. And it's interesting, though, that she says it like that, because it's a really weird way of looking at life. Now, don't get me wrong, because I feel like everyone should have pride in their own accomplishments. But I also think that one of your accomplishments is your relationships. It's probably the biggest one and the most important one. It's obviously the one that cost her the job with the people at Harvard. She had the opportunity to be part of the in crowd, not by virtue of color, but by virtue of being someone who can relate to those shared experiences of Harvard. And again, she has the chance to take advantage of a relationship through her boyfriend that I guess she doesn't want to take it. But it's weird that it would be turned down, because that is very much something that she would have gotten for herself. She got it by getting a boyfriend who can get it, right? Like, as we reach out to each other and we help each other as human beings, that's always going to be the case. As a matter of fact, like when you go to an interview, you're not getting the job based on your own accomplishments. You're getting the job based on the ability to forge a relationship in that interview with that person. Usually that's what earns you the place. Sure, your qualifications might get you that interview, and you might have plenty of qualifications that you can be proud of that get you there, but relationships are what drive the social atmosphere. Relationships are what drive your upward mobility in jobs. They would drive your access to jobs. They would drive your access to education. They would drive everything. So never be ashamed of achieving a relationship. Ever. That's wild. Like, take it. If you've got a hookup, take it. There's a quote between, so he runs a podcast, him and his African American friend. He runs a podcast, and they run together, and there's this one show after, he kind of like, they run into the situation where they break up, and then of course they have to have that catharsis at the end. But he says, it just won't ever work, and she agrees, his partner agrees, says, the deal is that white people are like the cheaters in an unfaithful relationship, right? And this is an interesting critique on society, right? White people are the cheaters, and black people are always going to be like the jealous girlfriend that wants to let it go and wants to get past it, but just can't let it go. You just keep on asking questions. Did you get this sexual favor? Did you get that sexual favor? What did you like it? That kind of stuff. And I've seen that kind of jealousy in many other movies, and even in real life sometimes I've seen situations like that. So I can understand what she's trying to say. But I don't feel that it's a very apt analogy. And the reason for that is so many of the white people in America today either have nothing to do with slavery, with Jim Crow, with any of most of the ancestral history in America isn't from America, right? And sure, they may have European ties, and then you could like very loosely relate them to Europe, and then relate those Europeans to other Europeans who had come over to America and been part of the slave trade. But you could also relate people, in Africa that were part of the slave trade, and then later, it's just such a mess after you get past that first degree. And this is why I preach that it is interpersonal relationships, one-on-one, that matter. A man or woman should be responsible for their own actions, not the actions of their brethren, not the actions of their friends, their family, their race, not the actions of their ancestors, their own actions. Never should somebody be held accountable for an action that they don't take unless, and this is the only exception, unless they are the leader of that action, right? Like, so the only time where I would take responsibility of actions that aren't mine is when, for example, in my management career, when I was the boss, because I indirectly have to assume responsibility because I'm supposed to be the role model, right? When somebody looks up to you, it's a little bit different. But I don't take responsibility for the actions of my father. I don't take responsibility for the actions of his father. Of course, nobody in my family has had anything to do with racial injustice or racial inequality, but that's not the point. The point is, I don't take responsibility for those actions. If you go back far enough in the past, everyone has slavery. Everyone. If you go back far enough in the past, everyone has social injustice. Everyone. Now, the obvious point that is valid that was made over the dinner table is that slavery wasn't that long ago, right? And there needs to be a sensitivity of that in the nation, right? We do have to respect the fact that of all of the social injustices in the world, right, that one is pretty recent. It's not what I would call very recent. Um, and I feel like we should try to stop considering it recent. Don't get me wrong, I realize that it is, and I feel like everybody should know that it is. But the fact that it keeps getting thrown out there as recent, I feel is something that just strains the relationships between between the races, right? It's one thing for there to be a transgression in the past, and let's say that you have a transgression in your own personal history, right? It's like that. Like she mentions, if one person won't let it go, then the relationship can never progress. And don't get me wrong, it makes perfect sense in that context where she's discussing a single person who is responsible for their own actions and they cheat. Heck yeah, sometimes that relationship's just done. Sometimes there's no way to repair that relationship because that person needs to accept responsibility for their own actions. But if you take that exact same situation, you're like, yeah, but your father cheated on his wife. You're like, but I'm not my father. That's the obvious answer, right? I am not them. I would never have dreamed of doing something like that. So you need to get past it with me because I don't have anything to do with it, right? And that's the situation, right, that we're dealing with in America. Yes, there's been injustice in the past. Yes. Heck, there's injustice now. It's rarer. It's much, much rarer. But there it is. It's there somewhere. You know, like you can see the effects of it if you watch some of the studies. There's definitely racism in the world. I didn't do it. Each person should be given the benefit of the doubt until they prove themselves unworthy of that benefit of doubt. People are responsible for their own actions. So that's why that's not a very good analogy. And I think that it's important to answer the movie's central critique with my counter. And that is each person is responsible for their own actions. And we should never be stuck in the past, in a past that we don't personally have any culpability for. And then, of course, the movie itself kind of gets past it. You know, they're saying like, well, it will never work. But then, of course, it does work. And I've seen it work. I've seen it work in the movie. I've seen it work in real life. Like, I mean, shoot, I'm dating an African-American and Hispanic girlfriend right now. And things are great. Except for the fact that my ex-wife may be forcing me to move, but aside from that, everything is great. Like we're getting along perfectly. There's no culture shock. Of course, I grew up in a very diverse community, so maybe I'm just lucky, but still, it can absolutely work. But you have to come at it with the opinion that it can work. You have to come at a relationship thinking we can make this happen. If you come at a relationship thinking, oh no, then it's never going to work out. You're basically creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. I know this has been a long one, guys. Let me know what your thoughts are. You know, let me know what you think. Put your comments down below. I fear that racism will probably never actually truly die out. I fear that is the case. Even if, you know, we continue to intermingle and you know, create relationship after relationship after relationship that's very successful, and eventually everybody turns into this like gorgeous caramel brown complexion, and maybe we can get past race. But the thing is even if we get there, which is, you know, obviously this is ridiculously optimistic, even if we get there, there's gonna be something else, right? Humans are always gonna come up with a reason to hate. They're going to come up with a reason to fear each other. They're going to come up with a reason to orchestrate differences between cultures and to create differences between social stratas. And that's just always going to be present. But the way I feel you can beat it is to approach each and every person as their own person, to talk to each and every person like they get the benefit of the doubt, like they get to be a human being in your eyes, wholly and completely, without you generalizing them into any other group, be that a past group or a present group. And that's essentially what racism is to generalize somebody as part of another group. I mean, it's just, in this case, it's racially specific, but Nobody should do that in any context, in my opinion. You should just talk to the person as the person they are. Treat that person as the person they are. And if you don't know what kind of person they are, don't assume the worst. Assume the best. That is how we get past the fear and the hatred in our society. And that's my best advice. I'll catch y'all next time on Couch Talk.